So the last couple of days, you've been teaching a CSS layout training. You've got the old, you've got the new. How did people respond to the different facets of CSS?
It's really interesting, actually. I find when I do this sort of thing, that often the older stuff, I kind of think, oh, people who are experienced, they're going to think, oh, I've seen all this before, I know this. They're going to sit there and sort of just wait for the cool new stuff to come along. And what I often find is it's those people that get the most out of the older stuff. Because one of the things that I think is really important is actually to explain why things are as they are. The problem with CSS for layout is we're using a load of methods which weren't really designed to do layout. So we're kind of forcing, everything's a hack. People say to me, oh, if I do this, is this a hack? And I say, well, everything's a hack. Everything that we do is a hack. And so it's which hacks work the best. But actually explaining where they come from and why things behave as they do, it's kind of like a light bulb moment for people, and I love that. And that can be people who've been working with CSS for years, or perhaps they've been working with a framework or whatever, and they kind of think they know this stuff, but they don't really know why things behave like they do. And so that's quite fun. And I often find it is the more experienced people get really as much out of that as a real beginner who is just learning all this stuff for the first time. So my day one was all of that legacy stuff, really, using floats and positioning and where all that's come from and how we use it now. And then I move on to all the new things, so Flexbox and Grid and really new CSS shapes and things like that. And then people start to get really excited. And the fun thing is once I get to Grid and I show them how to lay things out using CSS Grid layout, and they're like, that's so easy. And you can see people just thinking, why isn't this what we've been able to use? Why is this only just coming along now? And that's quite fun, because I think anyone looking at the Grid layout spec, it's a huge spec, and if they just handed it, they'd be like, this is really complicated. But actually, it's really simple. And actually doing all the different things is quite simple. So it's fun to introduce that after having shown actually how difficult everything is from the past.
It's a nice contrast with the past, where the parts were all hacks, but they were individually fairly simple.
Yeah.
The way they interacted was interesting.
Yeah.
But with the Grid, it seems like walking into it sort of piece by piece, even though it's huge, is more comfortable than guessing.
Yes, yeah, and I think the spec, CSS specs have to do an awful lot of jobs. They've got to, explain to a browser vendor how this should be implemented in the browser, as well as how authors should be using it to actually write CSS. And so if you look at the Grid spec, it's just enormous. I actually was at a workshop in New York City with one of the spec authors and one of the implementers, and we were just going through the spec basically line by line, which took us 2 days.
Wow.
To actually go through and explain it all and see which bits we didn't understand or that weren't very clear. So it's a big spec, but individually, the parts of it are very simple and much simpler than what we've been using.
What kind of a path do you recommend people take? Like, what are first steps into Grid layout like?
I think starting with the sort of line-based positioning, just positioning things on Grid lines, because that's really what it all comes down to. All the different methods of using Grid, and there are a few, come down to that there are lines on the Grid, and you can position things against those lines. And I've put together a bunch of examples on a site called gridbyexample.com, which is where I'm just putting these sort of experiments. And I've tried to break the spec down a bit into little examples to make it easier to just start to say, oh, this is how this bit works, and then build on that.
Digestible pieces.
Yes, yeah.
It's interesting, too, because the Grid, when I think of Grid systems, I think of them as sets of constraints. But they're, compared to what we were doing before, they seem to offer a lot of freedom.
Yes, yeah. Well, the issue is what we had before, we have, items in our layout didn't have any relationship to each other. So everything that we're doing with our floats and positioning and so on is we're trying to create the look of relationship between items on our page, when in fact we don't have any relationship. And if you remember back to the sort of faux columns technique, where we'd tile an image background and then sort of sit our layout on top of it, so it looked like we had a full height column. Now that sort of technique, that's what we've been doing for a long time. And that's because we didn't have that relationship. And so what Flexbox and Grid do is they give our items, a relationship as a whole layout. And that then makes a lot of things possible. It makes things like alignment possible, because we can say these things should be as tall as each other, or these things should be centered against each other.
Right.
All of that stuff is to do with relationship, and so that's what makes this a lot easier to use because things do have relationship.
So the relationships create the freedom, and that
Yes.
makes it work.
Yeah.
When can we get to these lovely things?
So, well, obviously Flexbox is pretty much, if you don't have to support very old browsers, you can really start using Flexbox. Grid is behind a flag in a lot of browsers or in nightlies. In the case of Firefox, the implementation's in the Firefox nightlies. There is a prefixed implementation in WebKit nightlies, but probably the easiest way to play around with Grid is to use Chrome and toggle the experimental web platform features flag, which then will let it all work. You can sort of play with my examples and things if you do that. When it will ship? Well, we think probably this year at some point all of the browser vendors seem to be, they're implementing. The spec actually originally came from Microsoft, so there's a very sort of early implementation in i10 and 11 and Edge, but it's old. It's now quite out of date compared to the new stuff. But they've put implementing the new version as high priority on their Edge backlog. So excellent. I assume that's going to come along with the other browsers. There is an issue with part of the spec which hasn't yet been implemented. There's this concept of subgrids. So like with Flexbox, things only become a grid item if they're a direct child of the thing that you declare display grid on. So just like with Flexbox, if you say display flex, those items become flex items, but their children don't. So it's the same with grid. Obviously, you can nest grids, so a grid item can become a grid container itself, but that subgrid won't have any relationship to the parent grid.
Okay.
And actually, what a lot of people are going to want to do is declare an overall grid, and then things, whether they're direct children or whether they are further down the tree, all respect that overall grid. I think that's how people would expect they'll be able to use it. And at the moment, you can't. But there is a subgrid keyword that would essentially allow that to happen. And it's not been implemented. And quite a lot of us feel that without it, we're going to create a bit of an accessibility issue, because people will be very tempted to flatten out their markup in order to be able to position things anywhere. Or do that with JavaScript, just strip out all the markup and then sort of fake containers and things. So we'll end up with this whole new set of hacks. And at the other weekend when we were talking about this, I think those of us who were there came to the conclusion that yes, we do need subgrid, and it would be worth waiting for the first implementations of grid to have it, so that we don't end up with grid shipping without something, which may then cause people to start doing really horrible things.
And it will be hard to bring back.
Yes, well, exactly. We know that once things get out there, people start to use them in whatever way they can. And I think the temptation for not just authors, not just people who are writing CSS by hand, but if you think about authoring tools or people creating sort of website builder type things, I think the temptation to just flatten out all the markup would be huge.
Right.
I think generally for both Flexbox and Grid, there's a big accessibility conversation to be had. It's not really my area. I'm someone who cares about accessibility, but I'm not an accessibility expert. And I'd really like to see those conversations starting to happen. And because we've got a layout method that essentially allows us to separate properly our source order from the visual display, but with that comes quite a lot of responsibility to make sure we're not making a terrible mess.
Right.
And making things very inaccessible, because we'll actually have the opportunity to do that. And it'd be good to start seeing those conversations happening and people writing about this stuff, so that it can, as Grid comes out and is released and people are using it, they're thinking about accessibility as they're implementing sites with it.
Yeah, I'm kind of heartened by some of the conversations I've seen lately where people are recognizing that accessibility helps in many different ways. And when you design a technology with accessibility in mind, you frequently get other kinds of simplicity and benefits. And they're the people we should listen to. Yeah,
definitely. I think, even just thinking about how well things work on mobile and how, actually if you're thinking about something being generally accessible, and that's not even going into actually, use it, to actually putting accessibility in, using ARIA or whatever, just actually making the thing as accessible as possible just by default, just by the nature of the source. And this stuff should make it easier for us to do that, but it could also leaders to ignore it.
Right.
There's kind of two ways you could easily go with this stuff. So yeah, I'd like to see more of those conversations happening, really.
Good. Well, we'll keep pushing on them. To step back a little bit from the details of the spec, there's kind of at Fluent, one of the first time we had it, one of my favorite talks was you don't need a framework for that, which was telling JavaScript programmers where they didn't need frameworks and could even use CSS for things. You also cross over the client side and the server side constantly. Who really needs to know CSS? I mean, we have legions of people who think that they just live on the server side and don't. Where's that balancing point?
I think there's always going to be people who specialise in one thing or the other. I think if you work on the web, then you need to understand what is possible. Because people are going to ask you to implement. If you're just doing server-side stuff, I mean, I have a content management system product, so we're creating a system that allows people to template their content and then interact with it, using CSS or using JavaScript or whatever. So actually, just us sort of understanding the front end is very, very important, because otherwise we could be building a system that would be very hard for front end developers to work with. And that, to be honest, is one of the benefits of our product, I think, is that it's developed by people who care about the front end. So I think it's important for back-end developers, even if you're not writing CSS, to understand what's possible and to understand what is possible with modern CSS, rather than assuming that it's like it was 5 years ago, perhaps, when you initially learned this stuff and thought, actually, I don't want to do front end, I'd rather stay on the back end. It's because we're all working together. The end result, is that website, is that web application. No one using it is thinking, yes, the back-end developer made these poor choices, which caused all sorts of problems to the front-end person.
Not unless they're doing view source and really getting deep into the mix.
We're all one team, and so I think the more that we all know about the other stuff, the better decisions we can make. In terms of all sorts of things. Optimizing for speed. There's places at the front and the back end that we can be looking at that right across the stack. So the more we understand, we might not necessarily want to spend our time writing CSS, but if we understand what is possible and what front-end people might be trying to do, that's useful.
I was just thinking back to the conversation about source order and the ways that can be scrambled. That the back end tends to control that.
That's it. If you're the person who's outputting that stuff, it might be that your front-end people just haven't really got a lot of control, and they might be forced to make poorer decisions because they don't have that control. So I think it's good. We should be working in teams with this stuff, because it's not a separate thing anymore. I mean, a few years ago, you'd kind of like build stuff and then sort of throw it over the fence and say, well, do whatever with that, and that we can't work like that anymore, because there's so many things that have to run through the stack, and decisions we can make about whether we do something on the server side or whether we do it in the front end, and that that point changes with different applications. And we can only have those discussions if we're working closely together and we understand what each other are doing.
Great. Well, hopefully we can get those balances right. We can make sure that the two sides of the conversation are one team. And I look forward to seeing more about this. Thank you.
Yeah.